Over the course of millennia, the Lords of the Sith proved to be one of the greatest threats to life in the galaxy. Time and time again, they spread terror and despair across the stars in their endless quests for power, battling the Jedi and the Republic in forms ranging from mighty empires to reclusive cults. They are known widely among fans as the ultimate face of evil in the Star Wars universe, but was the evil of the Sith all-consuming, or did their code have some merit to it? Was it possible to simultaneously be a good person and also a Sith Lord? In this video, we're going to be answering those questions. The answer to our title question is simple: no. So that's our look at why the Sith were evil. We hope you enjoyed this video and we'll see you in the next one. Just kidding, we've got a good deal more to discuss about this topic today. But our short answer is still the same. When it came to active Sith Lords, meaning those who hadn't repented or otherwise renounced the Sith in some way, they were unequivocally equal by default, without a single exception. Now, get your hands off your keyboards. We know the supposed exception you're thinking about, and we're going to talk about him later in this video. Just bear with us for a little while.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
To understand why the Sith were inherently evil, let's take a look at the basics of who the Sith were. First and foremost, the Sith were Darksiders. They rejected the will of the Force and instead imposed their own will on the Force, using it for their own purposes. This required raw, powerful emotion, usually negative ones like anger and hatred, and it was inherently selfish, as it was putting one's own desires over the greater good of the universe. This manner of using the Force was unnatural, a perversion of how the Force was meant to be. It was inherently chaotic and unbalancing, in contrast to the light side, which sought to preserve balance in the Force. The unnatural nature of the dark side meant that it had to be routinely purged from the galaxy for balance in the Force to be maintained. Insidiously, the dark side was much like a strong narcotic, with those who used it tending to become addicted to the power it granted. To paraphrase George Lucas's explanation of this phenomenon, since giving in to selfish desires was never truly satisfying, Darksiders would keep wanting more, and thus they would keep giving in until the dark side consumed them. It was impossible to safely use the dark side in moderation, or to balance the dark side with the light, due to this corruption of the spirit. Because of this, simply by practicing the dark side, Darksiders actively destabilized life in the universe, and most considered anything done in the pursuit of power to be acceptable, including atrocities. Sith did all this to an even greater degree. The Sith were not simply Dark Jedi or some dark side equivalent to the Jedi Order. They had their own specific dark side philosophy derived from the original philosophy of the Jedi exiles of Korriban. This philosophy is best described by one of their more concise proverbs: "We will take what we desire because we can. We can because we have power. We have power because we are Sith." The Sith were the utmost extreme of the dark side. Their philosophy was founded on the belief that those who fare better in life are inherently superior to those who don't, and deserve all they have by virtue of having it. Conversely, those deemed weak or inferior were unworthy of anything, even life. Some of them claimed that this was just nature, the way of the universe, though that was actually incorrect, as many species were naturally cooperative and altruistic to a degree, including humans. Most Sith didn't bother to justify themselves in such ways, however. By and large, Sith didn't care about nature or morality. Themselves, and more specifically their personal power, was all that mattered to them. If the dark side was an addictive narcotic, the Sith tried their hardest to overdose on it. Like all Darksiders, Sith used strong emotions to fuel their Force abilities, but they placed a unique emphasis on purely selfish emotions and motivations. In many Sith orders, most notably Darth Bane's Order of the Sith Lords, aspiring Sith would have to murder someone, usually someone close to them, in cold blood to be truly considered a Sith. Darth Bane himself did this when he murdered his father, Darth Sidious did this when he butchered his whole family, Darth Tyrannus did this when he killed Cypher Dyas, and Darth Vader did this when he killed Padme. This ritual act, known as a Sith sacrifice, was meant to sever the aspiring Sith from whatever emotionally grounded them in the universe, leaving the selfish desire for power as their only motivation. To quote the Revenge of the Sith novelization, "It is in this blazing moment that you finally understand the trap of the dark side, the final cruelty of the Sith, because now, Yourself is all you will ever have. Now, there are many different takes on morality in the world, and it's not our place to arbitrate which are right and which are wrong. For the sake of objectivity, we're going to be assessing morality in this video, and in all of our other videos, according to the guiding morality of the Star Wars universe. But irrespective of moral tendency, I don't think it's an unreasonable assumption that most of you would agree that most, if not all, of what we described is evil. Particularly, the cold-blooded murder part. When describing Sith history, evil is one of the first words that should come to mind. Their unending pursuit of power led the Sith to build some of the most monstrous empires in galactic history, all of which were built on slavery and frequently participated in genocide and other terrible crimes. Whenever the Sith were still in power, trillions of beings were sure to suffer, and the rare good that occasionally happened under Sith empires was always outweighed by the bad. When the Sith weren't in power, they were just as monstrous in their pursuit of it, though obviously they were able to do much less harm. But an oft overlooked side of Sith evil was how the dark side affected life itself. You're probably quite familiar with how the physical appearances of some Sith Lords were ruined by long-term dark side use, with the most notable example of being what happened to Darth Sidious. A more extreme example would be King Omin of Onderon, whose lifelong dark side use ultimately turned him into a vegetable, only capable of movement with the help of a cybernetic exoskeleton. This is because the dark side itself was unnatural, and the practice of it was actively destructive to life. This corruption didn't just affect the Sith themselves, however. All living things around them were affected by it to a degree, or could at least sense it. Many Sith took advantage of this and used the dark side to corrupt life intentionally. The first Sith Lords, the exiled Dark Jedi of the 100-Year Darkness, had used the dark side to create Leviathans, monstrous Sith-spawn creatures that they used as war beasts. Many other dark side techniques were developed for similar purposes over the years, used for everything from draining the life forces of other beings or creating dark side fueled plagues. These techniques were what set the Sith apart from other Jedi, and they were why the Jedi Order saw the Sith as the single greatest threat to the galaxy. But those things are criticisms of the Sith as a whole. Life warping techniques, genocide, and empire building weren't really rules that all Sith had to follow, just paths that most Sith took. We're here to see if there were any exceptions to the rule, or if the founding philosophy of the Sith inevitably led to those sorts of evils. This brings us to a Sith Lord that some of you have probably been waiting to hear us mention, Darth Vectivist. As the story goes, Darth Vectivist was originally a businessman who ran a remote asteroid mining facility. His employees discovered a nexus of dark side energy that slowly eroded their sanity, so he closed the mine and covered up the incident, intending to study the nexus himself. His studies led him to discover that he was force sensitive, and the dark side nature of the nexus led him to seek out the Dark Lord of the Sith and apprentice himself to them. This was during the time of the Rule of Two, so Vectivist eventually murdered his master and became the new Dark Lord of the Sith, taking on his own apprentice. However, as the Dark Lord of the Sith, Vectivist supposedly did none of the evil things characteristic of his order. He continued to uphold the moral principles he had clung to before joining the Sith. Vectivist simply devoted himself to the study of the dark side, developing his own force techniques in secret, and died peacefully surrounded by his family and friends. Hearing this, you might be thinking that our initial premise was wrong. Surely, Vectivist would count as a good Sith Lord. Well, not so fast. Firstly, the reliability of this story is rather sketchy, something that those who tell it tend to leave out. The only source we have for this story is Lumia, the self-styled Dark Lady of the Sith and an infamous liar in her own right, who told it to Jacen Solo in a bid to sway him to the dark side. We know for a fact that Darth Vectivist was a real being, and that he was at least nicer than your average Sith Lord, but we don't know to what extent the details of Lumia's story were true, or whether it was the whole story. As we mentioned, Vectivist was a member of Darth Bane's Order of the Sith Lords, and Lumia explicitly said that he was a Sith Master. If that's the case, then Vectivist was responsible for at least 2 murders, the first when he performed the required Sith sacrifice, and the second when he killed his master. This also makes it unlikely that he actually died peacefully, as that would have been a real kink in the known timeline of the Banite Sith, but we're gonna leave that alone since it's purely speculative. What's not speculation is that Vectivist must have had an apprentice, and through that apprentice, the line of the Sith continued down to Plagueis and Sidious. And that's the big dilemma with Darth Vectivist. Even if every word Lumiya said was true, and even if she omitted nothing of importance, then Vectivist still had the blood of trillions on his hands. There are no two ways around the fact that as a Sith Master under the rule of two, he and he alone was entirely responsible for the survival of Sith teachings beyond his generation. He could have prevented Darth Sidious and all the terror he unleashed on the galaxy, but he didn't. He had the power to single-handedly prevent all the evil the Sith would go on to unleash, but he didn't use it. This wasn't a matter of Vectivist being naive or ignorant of the future or whatever. Anyone who knew the first thing about the Sith knew that the vast majority of the Sith were absolute monsters, and even if Vectivist wasn't, he kept that legacy alive. He believed in the ideology of the Sith, that the weak deserve to die and the strong deserve whatever they can take, enough to teach it to an apprentice. Just by using the dark side, furthermore, he was responsible for corrupting life around him, which in itself is evil. Additionally, if Vectivist really did hold the morals Lumiya ascribed to him, and he wasn't always seeking greater power, as Lumiya claimed, then he wasn't really good at being a Sith Lord. Citing him as an example of a good Sith Lord is like citing Pong Krell as an example of a Jedi. Just as it's not really accurate to call Pong Krell a true Jedi, it's not really accurate to call Vectivist a true Sith. You can't just take the Sith code, ignore the parts you don't like, and call yourself an example of how Sith Lords can be good, because in ignoring part of the code, you've ceased to be a proper Sith. This also goes for those who were indoctrinated under Sith empires, but later turned away from the evils they represented, like Darth Maul. The bottom line is that no matter what other moral principles a Sith Lord were to hold, no matter what a Sith Lord did and didn't do, they were inherently evil by virtue of being Sith. The ideology of the Sith usually leads to terrible evil, and even the best behaved Sith Lords performed evil by simply practicing the dark side and spreading it to others. The dark side was a tumor on the Force. Using it was in itself opposition to what was the greater good for the galaxy, for the will of the Force always knew better than any one individual. Those who used the dark side to such a degree that they could call themselves Sith were responsible for unbalancing the Force and working against the greater good of the galaxy. So that's why all Sith were inherently evil by virtue of being Sith. But what do you think? Do you agree with our assessment, or do you have a different opinion? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. And just before clicking the next suggested video about Palpatine's sex life, make sure you check out some of our links in the description below, including our brand new channel called The Braved, where we delve deep into history to bring you some of the most badass people from all different eras. And if you're more into music, check out our Relax Jack, where we use a lot of the music produced there on the channel here. And if you want access to a behind the scenes Discord where you can chat to myself and the team members who make this video, consider donating to the Patreon. Also, if you want to join us in our Geetsly's gaming network and Geetsly's main Discord, all those links are in the description below. Anyways guys, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.